Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. It is Thursday. Let us begin with a recap of where we are up to in the Rambam. We are learning the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which has 14 volumes. We are up to volume number 8. Volume number 8 covers 9 subjects and 95 chapters. It's a big one. Sefer Avodah, all about temple service. So these are the 8, or what did we say, the 9 topics. And we've made some headway. We learned about the temple, the Beis HaBechira. We spent 8 chapters on that. And then we learned 10 chapters about the utensils of the temple. We learned another 9 chapters about entering the temple, another 7 on forbidden offerings. And now we come to Maaseh HaKorbanos, actually bringing the offerings. We have 19 chapters on that. Today we are learning chapter 2. So we've just begun. We'll be busy with this for approximately the next 3 weeks. We'll be learning all about the actual offerings that would be brought. Now, in case you feel that this is a little less relevant than you would like it to be, actually, a very large percentage of the mitzvahs in the Torah relates to what we're learning about right now, the actual offerings and the different offerings that would be brought. And every neshama needs to, through the course of all of its journeys, fulfill all of the mitzvahs. Some mitzvahs it's able to achieve via the king or in other ways, but every neshama needs to do every mitzvah. We daven for Mashiach, but we'll be able to do these mitzvahs once again and understand their significance in a deeper way. But in the meantime, our sages tell us that somebody who learns about the offerings is considered as if he brought them. So we are actually doing many mitzvahs that most Jews around the world have never had an opportunity to do. We are doing them by studying about them. So stay tuned as we learn about all of the different mitzvahs associated with the offerings that were brought in the Beis HaMikdash. Let's take a look at what is discussed in this chapter. So these titles over here are not from the Rambam. It's just from a publisher that I'm following. So he breaks up the 19 chapters into these topics. The first 2 chapters speak about the offerings and what accompanies them. The next few chapters will speak about who brings an offering and how he brings it. Then we'll speak about 4 specific types of offerings, then 3 chapters on that, and 4 chapters on that. Then we'll speak about eating from the offering. Are you allowed to eat from the korban? We'll speak about libations. We'll speak about that today as well, but we'll speak more about it later, chapters 12 and 13. We'll speak about pleasures. If a person offered to bring an offering, he made a pledge. And then finally, offerings outside of the Beis HaMikdash. But for today, let's take a look at chapter 2 of Maaseh HaKorbanos. Here we go. So, there was wine, flour, and we'll see in a moment, oil, that would accompany many of the animals that were brought as offerings. So these are called the wine and the flour that would be brought together with an offering are called the accompanying offerings. They're called in Hebrew the nesachim. Nesachim, if you ask the guy off the street, would say libations, which one would associate specifically with liquids. But interestingly, the Rambam says that the flour that accompanied the animal is also under the category of nesachim, which they've translated as accompanying offerings. The fine flour alone, if you're just talking about the fine flour alone, we'd refer to it as minchas nesachim, accompanying meal offering. Now, when a person brought a korban, they would need to wave the animal. It has spiritual significance. Waving the animal in different directions causes the negative energies of the world to be put away with. If I recall correctly, I think we speak about it. I remember learning about it in connection with Yom Kippur. We hear about waving in different directions. So although the animal would need to be waved, the flour that accompanied it did not need to be waved. It would not need to be brought to the corner of the altar, which would be done to sometimes the wine, nor offered with frankincense. So none of that. It requires salt. Anything that's brought in the base of English requires salt. Salt has spiritual significance. The reason why anytime we eat bread, we dip it into salt is to recall how when we would bring offerings to Hashem, it would all require salt, and is burned on the outer altar in its entirety. So the flour that accompanies the offerings would need to be burnt outside completely. That's as far as the flour is concerned. What about the wine? So the wine is poured over the altar. It's not poured over the fire. That wouldn't do very well. Instead, the priest should lift up his hands and pour it on the altar's base. And from there, it would descend to the shittin. So you actually had a gutter system where they would pour the wine on the side of the mizbeach, and from there it would flow down into a system, a gutter system where it would end up in specific places. These were referred to the shittin. Sorry, I don't have pictures with me. Perhaps another time. Next time round. Accompanying offerings are required only for an animal brought as a burnt offering or as a peace offering, only if it is a oila or a shlamim. So a person would bring different offerings for different reasons. So a certain offering was called an oila, which was completely brought on the altar, a shlamim, which is referred to as a peace offering. These would require their accompaniments, whether it was a communal sacrifice or an individual sacrifice, a sheep brought by a woman who gave birth, or a ram brought by the Kohen Gadol. If it was a burnt offering, it requires the accompanying offerings, the flour and a wine that we're speaking about. Accompanying offerings are not brought for sacrifices of birds. If a person would bring a bird as an offering, it would not be accompanied by flour and wine. Guilt offerings, sin offerings, if a person sinned and needed to bring an offering, it would not need to be accompanied, with the exception of the sin offering and guilt offering for a person who had been afflicted with tsaras. A person who has tsaras would need to bring a sin and guilt offering, and he would need to have the accompanying flour and wine as it is specified in the Torah. Now, how do we know that sin offerings and guilt offerings, a chatas and an asham, are not accompanied by flour and wine? Well, the Torah says about accompanying offerings to utter a vow or a pledge, meaning that these accompaniments are only brought for offerings that can be brought as a vow or a pledge, which excludes a sin or guilt offering, which is not something you offer to do. You don't, I'd like to offer to sin and bring an offering. It doesn't work like that. This is if a person did sin and need to bring an offering, it's not something that a person can pledge. The firstborn offering, again, is something that is not voluntary, something that Hashem says must be brought by the firstborns. Tithes, again, paschal sacrifice, since these offerings are not brought because of a vow or a pledge, they do not require accompanying offerings. I'm sorry, I do need to quickly attend to something. I will be back in about 30 seconds. Apologies. So what are we saying? We're saying that alongside offerings, there would be flour and wine offered, but they would only be offered by an offering that could potentially be brought voluntarily, which excludes all of these offerings which are not voluntary. which is the source that teaches us to include the festive peace offerings and pilgrimage burnt offerings, as it says, on your festivals. So, how much flour needs to be offered? How much wine? Let's see. If a person brings a sheep, a male or female sheep, he would need to bring in his saroid. And his saroid is the equivalent of 43.2 eggs. Now, an egg is approximately 56 mil. So if you times 56 mil by 43.2, the total is 2,419. Did I do something wrong over here? No, he doesn't. So 2,000, it's approximately 2 liters, right? A liter is 1,000 mil, about 2.5 liters, the equivalent of about 2.5 liters of fine flour. I'm talking liters. I guess I should rather say cubic millimeters, if it works like that. Anyhow, it's the equivalent of 43.2 eggs. That's how much flour he would need to bring, which I guess if we were talking in kilograms, would be about 2.5 kilograms. So when you buy a bag of flour, what's that? I think that they come in 1 kilogram bags. So it would be about 2.5 bags of flour. So that's how much flour would be brought. So when a person brought a sheep as an offering, alongside it, he would bring about 2.5 kilos of flour. How much wine or how much oil? So 1/4 of a hin. A hin is equivalent to 12 loig. A loig has 4 revius. A revius is 86 mil. So let's go over here. 86 times 4 equals 344 mil in 1 hin. Sorry, 344 mil in a loig. A hin is 12 loig. So 1/4 of a hin would be 3 loig. So that would be 3 times 344, which is just over a liter. Okay, so when a person brought a sheep, is that what he says here at the bottom? He doesn't mention the details. But either way, it's just over a liter. So whenever a person brought an animal as an offering, he would bring about approximately 2.5 kilograms of flour, of fine flour, and about a liter of wine. And about a liter of oil, 1/4 of a hin of oil. These are also the accompanying offerings for a goat, whether small or large, whether male or female, and for a ewe, even if she's large. So that's all for sheep and goats. What about a ram? Isn't a ram a sheep? Older. Is a ram older? Yeah, I think so. But he didn't mention before. He said a male or female sheep. A ram is larger. He's older. I think at least a year or two old. The accompanying offerings for a ram, however, are 2 esrainim of flour. So now we're talking about 5 kilograms of flour mixed with 1/3 of a hin. Instead of 1/4, it's 1/3. So that would be about, gets a bit complicated. How do you turn 1/4, which is a liter, into 1/3? You've got to get something that 3 and 4 go into. So let's say that's 12. So 4, 8, 12 would be, if we go in quarters, and then 3, 6, 9, 12 would be. So instead of being 3/12, it would be 4/12. That still doesn't help us. I guess you got it. Okay, maybe we'll leave it for now. Have to practice my mathematics. But 1/3 of a hin would be probably around 1.2 liters, I imagine, of oil, and 1/3 of a hin of wine as a libation. So if you're getting bigger, if you're now dealing with a big sheep, a ram, then you would bring double the amount of flour and a little bit more of wine and oil. The oil would be mixed into the flour and the wine would be poured separately. What about a cow? Cows are much bigger. Cows are much bigger than sheep. I don't know the last time you hung out with the two, but cows are much, much bigger. So if a person is bringing a cow or a calf, whether male or female, 3 esraidim would be necessary. So that's not 2.5 kilos, not 5 kilos. 7.5 kilograms of flour would need to be mixed, it would need to be brought alongside with it, together with a half of it. So that's now 2 liters of oil. So interestingly, proportionately, it's 3 times the amount of that which is brought with a goat, 3 times the amount of flour, but only 2 times the amount of oil. So that's just how it would work. And again, half a hin, which is about 2 liters of wine, which would be poured on the side of the mizbeach. Okay, so 3 measures are applicable for the accompanying offerings, for burnt offerings and peace offerings, for each animal offered. There's 3 different measurings. According to the number that you offer, so shall you do for each one according to the number. We may not increase these measures, nor may we decrease them. If somebody increases or decreases the measure by even the slightest amount, one disqualifies the accompanying offering. So I guess it's these 3 measurements that we gave, either for a goat or young sheep. Higher than that is for a ram, and higher than that is for a cow. The only exception is the sheep offered as a burnt offering on the day of the waving of the Omer. I'm sure you're all familiar with us counting the Omer. Counting the Omer would be done from the 2nd day of Pesach until Shavuos, from when we brought the Omer offering. And when the Omer offering would be brought, it would be brought together with a sheep as a korban oila, as a burnt offering, and that would have a different measurement. The accompanying offering for it would be 2 esraidim mixed with 1/3 of a hin of oil. So although it is a burnt offering and it is a sheep, we would still go with 2 esraidim, not 1, and 1/3 of a hin. Although the measure of flour was doubled, the measure of wine was not, and only 1/4 of a hin is brought as a libation. So that would be specifically by the Omer offering. Another exception is a person who had sarat, somebody who had spoken lashon hara or other forms of sin that he would be deserving of leprosy, spiritual malady. So when he became pure, he would need to bring 3 esraidim of flour for the 3 sheep which he brings as a sin offering, a guilt offering, and a burnt offering. So although they are different offerings, they would all have the same accompaniment. According to the oral tradition, we know that they come because of the sacrifice he brings. And Nisaran for each sheep mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil. The revius of wine should be brought with each of the esraidim. The revius is much less. The revius is only 86 mil, as is the rather than 1,000 mil, or half. Yeah, as is the rule for accompanying offerings for all sheep. When one brings the pilgus is a mixture between a ram it's older than a year, but it's younger than a year and a month. It's during that year and its first month. He should bring with accompanying offerings for a ram, so he should treat it as a ram. Nevertheless, it is not considered as if he brought appropriate sacrifice, because he should have brought a sheep. A hin has 12 loig. We have already stated that the measure of a loig, together with the other measures, in Hilchos Eiruvin, we already discussed what these measurements are. And the Nisaran is an Omer, which is the measure of dough from which challah must be separated. We have already explained this measure with regards to the mitzvah of challah. Now, when the accompanying offerings or the meal offerings are measured, whether for an individual offering or communal offering, they should not be measured in a measure of 3 esraidim for a bull or 2 esraidim for a ram. Instead, everything should be measured with the measure of 1 isaron, and it would be used multiple times. So you had different measuring cups, and the measuring cup that was used would be of 1 isaron. 1 isaron is big, right? We said it's about 43 eggs, which we said is about 2.5 kilograms. But you'd have a 2.5 kilo measuring cup, and you wouldn't have a 5 kilo measuring cup or 7.5 kilo. Rather, you would just use that same 1 isaron measuring cup again and again. Also, the oil that would be brought accompanying the offering should be measured with appropriate measure in the temple. The oil for a meal offering brought by an individual is measured in the measure of a loig that existed in the temple, and the number of lugan of oil is determined by the number of flour. So again, rather than having larger measuring cups, you would have used that same measuring cup and just fill it up multiple times. Now, what happens when it overflows? So the overflow of the measure of flour is not considered holy, it's regular. Why? Because the outside of the measuring cup of the flour is not holy, and therefore if flour overflowed onto the outside, it can be consumed regularly. But the overflow of the wine and oil is what overflows is also holy. Why? Because it flows down the back of the utensil, and when it comes to liquid utensils, both the inside and the outside have been consecrated and are holy. Now, why were the overflows consecrated, even though the person measuring only intended to sacrifice what was inside? That wasn't his intention. So that it would not be said that substances are used for ordinary purposes after having been in a sacred utensil. So although usually the intention is necessary, since people would see it going over the sacred utensil, and then they would see if it would be used as a salad dressing on your next picnic in a non-holy way, people would think that food or oil that had gone into vessels can be used for mundane purposes, which is generally not the case. So therefore, the rabbi said that whatever overflows would remain holy. So what would they do with the overflow? So if there was another sacrifice, they could use it for the other sacrifice. But if the oil or wine remained overnight, they become disqualified. We said they wouldn't be allowed to remain overnight once they had been consecrated, once they had been made holy. If not, they were redeemed, meaning if it hadn't gone overnight and there wasn't another offering, then they would be redeemed for cash, and that cash would be used for offerings that would be brought as a dessert for the altar. So we're going to speak about a certain times of year when there weren't as many offerings, then they would bring just extra offerings as dessert. What is implied? Burnt offerings are purchased with the proceeds of their sale. The meat is offered to Hashem and the hides are given to the Kohanim. Those are all the desserts for the Mizbeach. Okay. Now what happens if a person showed up to the Beis HaMikdash with his cow, with his sheep, with his goat, but he forgot to bring the flour? Ever happens that you want to make something and then you're missing some ingredients? Or he forgot to bring the oil or the wine. What does he do now? So the Rambam says that the flour mixed with oil of the accompanying offerings are not indispensable requirements preventing the offering of the wine libation. So if you forgot the oil or the wine, but you remember, if you forgot the oil or the flour, but you remembered the wine, okay, under the circumstances, you could bring the wine without it. Nor is the wine libation indispensable for the others. So if a person forgot the wine, he could still bring the others. Nor are the accompanying offerings an indispensable requirement preventing the offering of the sacrifices. If the person just brought the cow and he forgot to bring the wine, and he forgot to bring the flour, and he forgot to bring the oil, he could still bring the offering. And even if it's 10 days later, when he gets around to bringing the rest, that also works. Whether it's a private offering, an individual offering, or communal offering, provided that they hadn't yet been made holy. Once the flour or oil or wine was put into a sacred utensil, it has to be offered that same day, or else it will be disqualified. Okay, another important one is these accompaniments, the flour, the oil, the wine, need to be brought from regular produce. They cannot be brought from special produce like teruma that we learned about, or second tithes, or first fruits. Even for the Thanksgiving offering, whose bread may be brought from the second tithe, the accompanying offerings, the flour, the oil, the wine, need to be brought from regular produce, not from special produce. We need to give our best to Hashem, but it needs to be ordinary. It can't be holy. Okay, here's an interesting one. If you open up the book of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel, you'll find a whole description of different measurements of these accompanying offerings of the Nesachim. He mentions a specific amount of flour and oil, wine, and it's inconsistent with what we have in the Torah. So how does that work? So the Rambam says all of his measurements and the offerings and the order that are written there in Yechezkel were only mentioned for inauguration offerings, which will be in the future, as we'll see in a moment when Mashiach comes here. There's actually a debate that whether the offerings that Yechezkel speaks about were of what were brought in the second temple or of what will be brought when Mashiach comes. But either way, it wasn't what's usually brought. It wasn't the standard mitzvah. Instead, the prophet commanded and outlined how the inauguration offerings will be brought at the time of the dedication of the altar, at the time of the coming of the King Mashiach, and the third temple will be built. So if you look at Yechezkel, and you see that that doesn't add up to what we've just learned, that's fine. It was an exception. These were inaugural offerings. Just as the princes offered sacrifices at the dedication of the altar in the desert. So if you read in the Chumash, we read about how each of the princes brought offerings, and those offerings again weren't the standards, bringing offerings that were not brought in coming generations, and they brought them on Shabbos. So we see that this was an exception. So to a prince will bring a dedication offering on Shabbos in the ultimate future, as stated there in Yechezkel. Similarly, the sacrifices which the people who returned to Zion from Bavel in the days of captivity brought, in the days of Ezra, again were only inaugural offerings and will not be practiced in the future. The practices to be followed in generations to come are the words of the Torah, of which we say, of Moshe our teacher, that we may not add to them or subtract to them. So just to explain what this means, a person is not allowed to change what it says in the Torah, but a prophet is allowed to make changes on a temporary basis. So the Rambam saying this, that you'll find that Yechezkel made changes to the volumes of offerings that were brought. This was something that was done temporarily by a prophet, which would be allowed, but on a permanent basis, the Torah does not change. Let us test your knowledge.